even people who say they haven't bought into capitalism to a certain degree, we all
Yeah.
bought in it, right? There's
yeah.
still that feeling of, but I don't know, like, what if they do drugs? Or as if somehow, poor is unworthy, or you're poor because you've done something wrong.
Hi, everyone. This is Raquel.
Hi, and this is Jennifer.
Welcome to Madness Cafe.
This is a feminist podcast where we talk about women's issues, politics, and health and wellness.
And where those issues intersect. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Madness Cafe. Today, Jennifer and I have a very amazing guest, and she has a very long bio. So I want to touch on all of it and get it all in there because I think it's really important to give her due. She's done a lot and achieved so much, and I want to touch on all of it. So our guest today is Silvia Dutchevici. She's a psychotherapist, mental health expert, author, and founder and president of the Clinical Therapy Institute. Silvia created Critical Therapy on perceiving a need for the theory and practice of psychology to reflect how race, class, gender, and religion intersect with psychological conflicts. She's a founding board member of Black Women's Blueprint and a member of the Physicians for Human Rights Asylum Network, where she conducts psychological evaluations documenting evidence of torture and persecution for survivors fleeing danger in their home countries. Silvia trained at the Bellevue NYU Survivors of Torture Program, the Parent-Child Center of the New York Psychoanalytic Society, and the New York Freudian Society. She has a master's degree in social work from New York University, a master's degree in psychology from the New School, and a bachelor's degree in religious studies and political science from Fordham University. Silvia has lectured and presented throughout the country on critical therapy, including at Fordham and NYU, and has been featured in The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, Psychology Today, The Guardian, International Business Times, and Women's Health. Wow, so much. Silvia, thank you so much for being our guest on the show today.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. This is really exciting.
Welcome. We are excited to talk to you, but the first thing I want to ask, which is really off topic, you are sitting in front of two huge bookcases. Did you read all those books?
Most of them. Unfortunately,
Oh, wow.
I always run out of space for books, have to figure out what's what.
Wow.
And this is in my office. I have the same setup at home, so that should.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Impressive.
Very impressive. What is your story and how did you get started in developing critical therapy?
Yeah. So, my story, where do I start? I have a very sort of interesting story, as most of us, right? I came from Romania when I was 13 years old. I was a political refugee. At that time, it was one of the most brutal dictatorships in Eastern Europe. I don't think that that's a coincidence of why, for me, the personal is always political, because I know how political realities affect and interact with one's mental health. So came to the United States, didn't think I was going to be a therapist initially. I studied religious studies. I didn't even think I was going to study religious studies. I ended up going to Fordham and majoring in political science. And because it was a Jesuit university, it requires that you take a religious studies course. So I was like, all right, let me do this. It was either theology or religious studies. I was like, I'm going to do religious studies. I'm going to do it in my first semester, get it over with, and that's it. Loved it. I think it has informed so much of my knowledge around culture, society, power, control, and so forth. Became one of my majors and so forth. Then I went to therapy. Therapy saved my life. As I often say, I did drink the Kool-Aid. I really believe it heals and cures. And while I was in therapy, I was slowly sort of thinking of becoming a therapist. Didn't think I had the patience for it, but apparently I do. It actually came from my therapist who was like, well, you claim that you don't have the patience, and yet you come to therapy and you're committed to this. So why would you think that you can't do it? And then I slowly sort of started training and became a therapist. I wanted to work, not coincidentally, with political refugees, survivors of torture, and so forth. And yet, I realized that most of the torture that we encounter, that we don't talk about, and that's the hardest to get over, happens in our homes. And it happens from our intimate partners. It happens from people who are supposed to love us. So I shifted and decided to work with childhood sexual abuse survivors, domestic violence. For a while, I ran domestic violence shelters. And it was there that I think this idea of critical therapy and a deep analysis of power came. Because what I've noticed was these women, and unfortunately, most of them were women who were escaping abusive situations, would come into therapy and have to reckon with power. And our model was either you're empowered, meaning you get to do whatever you want and you have power over someone, or you're the victim and then someone has power over you. And that cannot be the only model. That's the model that we practice as a society. That's the model that we teach our children. That's how we parent our children. And unfortunately, it doesn't really yield such great results. So one of the tenets of critical therapy is this deep analysis of power. Power as it happens in the clinical setting between you and your patients, and also power, your relationship to power as a therapist and your relationship to power as a patient, and how those things interact in the clinical hour. And then I've integrated sort of critical pedagogy that comes from Paulo Freire and liberation psychology that comes from Latin America. Basically, the tenets here are that the personal is always political, meaning that you cannot analyze someone's wellness and mental health issues independent of political realities. It's not about who you vote for. It's about how does abortion rights, how does gay rights, how does worker rights, and so forth impact and affect your mental health, because they do.
Yes.
And then the other thing is we believe that the clinical relationship is one of the most intimate relationship you end up having with someone, because you get to tell this person sort of everything. And the last one is we practice a politics of equity. And what we mean by that is we want good mental health services to be available to everyone. And in order to do that, we've created a very unique sliding scale. When I say sliding scale, most people think I know what I'm talking about it. Most organizations or therapists practice it, meaning that you have a standard fee or you have certain brackets, right, of fees, and everyone pays according to their income, but not really, right? So in the end, you really just lower your fee for people who can't afford you. Well, we don't do that. What we do is we have a truly sliding scale, meaning everyone who comes to us pays according to their income and resources, and they all pay the same percentage. So that session could be $50 or $2,000. That might sound right, but viscerally, there's a lot of conversations of what happens when you talk to people about what they should be paying their fair share, you know?
So what kind of conversations? Can you go into that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, even for progressive folks that want to sort of give to charity or believe in income, distribution, and they're on board, then they sit across from you and we talk about what you should be paying according to your income and resources. And all of a sudden, it just doesn't feel fair. There's two issues with this. I think the first one is everyone thinks that there should be a standard fee for therapy. The average in New York City now is about $200. And I think once you get to 5 or 6 or 1,000, people are like, $1,000? That sounds weird. Although the scale is equitable. It doesn't feel equitable because we do privilege people with money in very unconscious ways.
Yeah. And some very conscious ways.
Yes, that's true too,
And have you had people who are wealthier sitting in front of you deciding I refuse to be part of this system, I'm not gonna pay more? Does that happen?
Sure. And then we don't see them. And I know, because for me, at least, it's an ethical choice that I made. I think that if we want the scale to be equitable, if we want to practice and live out our politics, we can't just have them over there, right? In theory, we have to practice them day in and day out. And I think, and I've seen this, it's not that I think, I know that conversations around money and wealth are very important to one's mental health. And unfortunately, affluent people never get to talk about that, although they struggle with it, whether it's shame, whether it's narcissism, whether it's entitlement. But those conversations need to happen, but they don't happen because only poor people deal with money. We always ask poor
Yes.
people to have uncomfortable conversations about money. We don't ask affluent people to have those same conversations.
Oh my God, that is so true. I don't think I've spent as much time thinking about that aspect of it. But thank you for making it equitable and sticking to your guns with this. We all know there are so many people who need and want therapy, but cannot access it because of the cost. I just want to go ahead and just thank you for sticking to that and standing by your ethics on that. I think that's amazing.
Thanks. And I think the other thing we have to keep in mind is that there's also this dichotomy, which is false, of you either do good work as a social worker or as a therapist, or you sell out. And as
Hmm.
long as that dichotomy presents itself, capitalism, patriarchy, and our current society will never change. Because honestly, at some point in our lives, we all want to have nice things and a family and sell out. But that
Mhm.
shouldn't be considered selling out. And I wanted to really try this model because I really believe that we could do better and everyone could pitch in and change the world one person at a time. But it's hard. And
Yeah.
we don't want to try new models because they're messy, because they're new, right? So we're going to make mistakes. It's not going to be perfect. But instead of thinking outside the box, we often revert back to, well, I don't know if that's going to work. We're not going to do it.
I think we have to have more models like this. I have been seeing a lot on social media memes recently about wealthy people who have billions and billions of dollars are sort of like modern dragons sitting on their piles of wealth that they could never absolutely spend. And not saying anything bad about these people, but that they can walk past people who are starving in the streets.
Mhm.
We have to come up with new solutions. Congratulations on starting that work.
Thank
That's
you.
awesome.
And I it's interesting when you say that, because I do think there is something about when you have so much wealth, there is almost a disengagement from poor people because you don't get to
Yes.
see them. And then
Mhm.
if you tie that in with our ideology or our values that poor people are poor because they just don't work hard enough, you could
Mhm.
see why it's so hard to be like, I want to donate, I want to give to people. My fantasy, I often tell affluent people who want to help, don't give it to a nonprofit that usually has so many requirements for the people that are going to get these grants in order to, sort of get them. Just go to the affordable or housing or go to the projects and just give out money to people for no reason,
Yeah.
but just because they need it.
Wouldn't that
Yeah.
be an awesome world?
I know, right? How do people respond when you tell them that?
Well, I think some people are very much like, oh, that sounds like a good idea. Even people who say they haven't bought into capitalism to a certain degree, we all
Yeah.
bought in it, right?
Oh,
There's
yeah.
still
Yeah.
that feeling of, but I don't know, like, what if they do drugs? Or as if somehow poor is unworthy, or you're poor because you've done something wrong, and I'm
Right.
wealthy because I haven't. And that's not true. It's long histories of capitalism, racism, colonialism, and so forth.
Absolutely.
Wow.
I'm very curious when you say that you're putting sort of the politics back in therapy. How could traditional therapy even begin to work without putting the politics in? I don't understand that concept.
Yeah, there's this myth that to be a good clinician, you have to be outside of politics, right? Because it's a clinical matter, but it's deeply a human matter. And as humans, we're social beings. I will say is that more and more institutes, traditional psychoanalytic institutes, and more schools are starting to incorporate issues around race, class, and gender. But I feel it's always as a discussion rather than an embodiment. We usually talk about race, we usually talk about gender because of differences. So
Okay.
if you have two white people sitting chatting in the clinical hour, I don't know how much issues of race will come up if the therapist doesn't bring it up. But I believe
Good
that you
point.
need to bring it up because it's inherent to who you are. Because, and this is not like racism hurts everyone, but it is a little bit, it affects everyone, not the same way. But it's
Right.
something that if it's not analyzed, I don't think you could do good clinical work.
That's a very good point.
So if Raquel and I, both women, went to therapy with you, let's say, I'm a white woman, she's a Black woman. Would the beginning of therapy look different for the two of us in
The beginning, it looks different from person to person, right? So we go back to, Paulo Freire, and we go back to critical pedagogy and the fact that you teach students or you practice therapy where they're at, right? It's not a banking model, which is I come and I tell you what you should know and you memorize it and get it back to me. It's really a critical inquiry into your life and what has brought you to who you are today. But it's also, think about critical consciousness and consciousness raising from the feminist movements that sort of helps. But the conversation will be different, but we will always address the same topics. So even if you might not bring issues around class, I will bring them up because the sliding scale is there. If you don't bring issues about race, I will bring them up because of who I am and how does it play in our interactions, and so forth. For example, personally, I remember at some point wherever I interviewed for a job, the interviewer were always white people. Sure,
right.
I got the job because I'm smart and talented and so forth, but I also got the job because I'm white. And I think it's so hard to hold that sort of that complexity. It's not just this. It's really and this. And I think as long as we're able to talk about it, then we could have change. Now, I will also say it is therapy. My job is not to indoctrinate you, right? So, we've had people who came to critical therapy who analyzed their issues to, let's say, capitalism or racism. And, not everyone's going to end up transformed. Some people are like, yeah, I do exploit people, but I don't give a damn. And as clinicians, it's hard to sit with that, but we have to, because if we don't, then it's no longer therapy.
Right.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you take the term holistic to a whole other level.
Right.
Right.
Like, thank you. Yeah.
I think that's fantastic because we don't live our lives in a bubble. And when we go to therapy, I mean, how often have we gone thinking, oh, I'm going about this one issue, and then this whole onion just keeps getting peeled back and more layers and more layers. And you realize that it's not just this one issue. It's not just one thing. It's all connected to so many other things.
Well, it's never just one thing because we're not just one identity. If you think about intersectionality, and if you think about our relationship to different identities, to power dynamics, it's always interactive and it's always complicated. It can't be just a one issue. We're just going to look at that. I think when we do that, we miss a lot of nuance.
For sure.
Very good point.
I can't help but think that critical therapy sounds similar to critical race theory.
Yes, we incorporate, and you are correct. We incorporate a lot of the theory, and we do study Kimberly Crenshaw and so forth. And, it's funny you said that because someone who read my book for the review mentioned how much we do take from the feminist movement and from the critical race theory that's not explicit. So in my next book, which will be probably a bigger book as it needs to be, we'll make that explicit because I do think that it's also important.
Okay, we'll have to have you back when that book comes out too.
Okay.
How does it tie to feminism?
Well, it ties to feminism in the sense of you think about the many different identities. I think women always knew, right, whether it was more viscerally rather than theoretically, that we're not just one thing. You're not just a woman. You're also a mother. You're also a worker. You're also a wife or a partner and so forth. And how your different identities shapes who you are, how you show up in the world, but also how the world shows you or how the world defines you. I think one of the things that we tend to forget is we can define ourselves any way we want to, but there is unfortunately a way that the world gets to define us that we may not necessarily agree to. And usually that's tied to racism, classism, sexism, and so forth. And it is there.
It is there.
And that impacts our mental health. I could feel very empowered, but if I walk into a boardroom that, let's say there are like 12 men and I can't say anything except something that's looked as, okay, whatever, then that's going to impact who I am and how good I feel about myself. But usually traditional therapy is like, well, Silvia, let's look at that. And how did your parents parent you? And how does that influence how you took these comments, which is relevant? But there's a second part of, And we live in a society that no matter how good you feel about yourself, if you're not in a position of power at certain points, you will feel less than.
Right. Right. I mean, even
Yes.
somebody who has the strongest self-esteem, at some point, they are going to feel it.
Right. And you add to that, history of like racism, colonialism, sexism, and then we sort of say, how come you're not more well-adjusted? But to be
Ugh.
well-adjusted to a society that's not well-adjusted, means that we would be maladjusted, right? As,
Mhm.
Martin Luther King said, I don't want to be adjusted to racism. I don't want to be adjusted to sexism. I want to be maladjusted. And we should all be maladjusted till society does better, till we all do better.
Before we get a little too much into it, you talk about how critical therapy draws on liberation psychology. Can you talk about liberation psychology a little bit?
Sure. So liberation psychology comes out of Latin America.
Mhm.
It comes out from Martin Barrow, who talked about the fact that psychology is never apolitical. And in fact, psychology has been used to oppress people and to sort of teach them that their oppression is not as relevant as their own personal problems and mental health. And you could see why it came
Mm.
out of Latin America, because Latin
Mhm.
America has a long history of how political uprising and colonialism and how those impacted, people in very real way. So our commitment is to human liberation. And this is where we go back to this idea that we don't want you to adapt. We don't
Mhm.
want you to, sort of be in a society and be as the society wants us to be, but rather to challenge that and to figure out what are the cracks, right? One of the things I say is that we can't create a revolution overnight, and revolutions are not sustainable. What I'm interested in is cracks within the system that if we keep sort of having them more and more and imagine different things, that we could try different models. Go again to that dichotomy of if we're here and now we're here, it's still it's still about power. It's still about
Mhm.
exerting power rather than how can we use power differently to create
Mhm.
different ways of being in the world. And that starts at home. It's easy to think about out there, like,
Yeah.
yes, I'm gonna, and I think protests and all that is great, but no one really reckons with how do I embody this in my home, right? How do I
Mhm.
share household duties, right? How do I parent? I think parenting is a great example of how we need a sort of revolution or many cracks, as I say.
Agreed.
I think parenting needs, like, the feminist movement had a movement. I think kids need to have their own movement, but unfortunately they can't, because they can't
Mhm.
advocate for themselves very well because they're little. But we do this parenting over, right? We boss kids around. We don't give them any agency. We tell them what to do. And then, and especially for girls, and now even for boys, once they hit adolescence, we tell them just say no and trust yourself. And yet we don't allow them to do that ever.
We didn't
And
teach them that.
yeah, right. And all of a
Yeah.
sudden we expect them to know it all and to know how to have
Yeah.
healthy relationships.
That's huge.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. Just a little personal note. I've done a lot of dating, and I've been told by some of the men that my parenting is off because my kids argue with me. And I always try to explain, they don't argue with me. We have a discussion. And if they can't tell me no, how are they going to tell other people no? How are they going to advocate for themselves? So I'm really happy to hear you talking about starting in the home, because I've always thought that that was, where else can we actually make change?
Exactly. And we would never talk to our friends the way that we talk to our kids, right? So for example, the people
No.
who you end up dating who are like, well, why are you arguing? I would challenge them. Would you ever tell your friend, put your shoes on and let's just go? I don't want to hear
Get in
it.
the car right
Yeah.
now because I said so.
Right. And your friend
Right.
would be, no, and what is happening here, right? But
Yeah.
because they're kids, we just feel like, why don't we boss them around?
Because it's that power over
Yes.
dichotomy. If you had a different way to describe power for kids, or power in the workplace, or power in therapy, what's better than power over?
It's sort of how do we, so a couple of things. The first one is, so power is our ability to affect change in our own lives, right? Our agency, and also our ability to affect change in the system, whether it's society and so forth. So sometimes we have power in one area, not in other areas, and so forth. And also, power exists in every dynamic. I think this is one of my pet peeves, especially about dating or romantic relationships. We tend to shy away from power instead of embracing it and acknowledging it. And in every relationship, power will shift. Sometimes you have more power, sometimes your partner has more power, and so forth. So it's not a bad thing. The other thing is, if you think of power with, is how can I help you? Or power as a responsibility, then it's not something that we shy away. I think we shy away from power because we're afraid of it, because it's always been defined as something bad rather than a catalyst for change, right? I have power. Think about if you're at work and you're someone's supervisor or boss, you have a responsibility to them, and you can ignite change by being a more humane person, by asking for less work hours, paying them more, right? So that could be a powerful and great thing, but we don't think of power that way. We think of power as abusive.
That is true.
Wow. Is that because that's what we see the most of?
Right. Yes. And that's the model that we are taught at school, right? You have to get good grades. You're smarter than everyone, you know. In politics, that's the model we see. It's in our discourse. It's everywhere. We don't practice a collaborative, version of power that's really about how do we live in community with each other and how do we support each other?
Well, I think it's also partly that we've lost, or maybe we never had, I don't know, the ability to actually have a conversation.
Yes.
So this is kind of related to power, and the being power with, we don't even know how to speak with as a society. It's talking at somebody or just waiting for your turn to speak. The give and take isn't there. The collaborative effort of the conversation or the collaborative utilization of power isn't there.
Yeah, there is not a dialoguing that happens, right? Where we both respect each other and try to understand certain things of why do you believe the things that you do. And I think it's getting worse and worse in our society.
Oh, absolutely.
It's either this or that, or we don't even allow people to change their minds, which I don't find helpful at all. It's like, I hope most of us change our minds in the next 20 years because we grow and we understand more. And this is why I hope therapy can be that place where people can learn how to have more nuanced and difficult conversation, even when you are in conflict. Because even though my job is not to convince you of anything, my job is to critically ask you questions that you think about your beliefs and whether those are really your beliefs or something that has been passed down or you've been taught, or they're your beliefs because they give you some privilege and it's kind of nice to have that power and use it on people, but then you're also hurting them. Learning how to have those conversations in therapy, ideally, then people could go and practice out there in the world.
So how does that power dynamic work with the therapist and the patient? And then also, I'm very curious, you talk about it in the book, but I'd love you to share it with the listeners. How does love affect that relationship with the therapist and the patient?
So a little bit about, the power dynamic in therapy. It's funny, we have a whole course, obviously, on power in therapy. And one of the things we talk about is how we use power. So there's roughly about 3 stages in critical therapy. They're not always linear. So it's not like year 1, this stage. Sometimes they could happen in one session, right? They could be more circular. But the first stage is a power over. And that comes from traditional psychodynamic therapy. It comes from this idea that the therapist is the person that the patient invests in as the person who knows, who will save them, who is an expert. And we use that. We use that in order to facilitate transference, to develop a relationship, and to analyze the way you show up as a patient in other relationships. Now, I've been asked, and this is why I bring this class, I've been asked in my class, if we lived in a different society, would this first stage of critical therapy still be necessary? And what I mean by that is, if we lived in a society that was more collaborative, would we need to have power over our patients in order for them to trust us, in order for the transference to happen as fast as it does? Or would they look at us as if we're crazy? Like, why is this lady trying to pretend that she has power over me? I mean, I don't know. It'd be an excellent study, but we don't live in any society that's sort of so egalitarian and so collaborative that we could try that. But for now, so we practice this power over. And then we also do this because, especially for people who have been marginalized, who have felt that they've never had power, I think it's important to usurp that power and to claim it by practicing how to get it back, not by sort of a paternalistic view of, I'm going to give you power and now we're collaborative and we're equal, where nowhere else are we equal. So it's sort of, how do we learn to wrestle with power? If you've been disempowered, how do you get to claim it back? How do you get to a space where you fight for it? And again, you practice and you make the road by walking. If you do it in therapy, you're going to be able to do it in other areas of your life.
If I were going to do that in therapy, am I actually challenging the therapist to get some of my power back?
Yes.
Wow.
It's through a dialogue, it's through a discourse, it's through, when we get to you in the first, I would sort of like exert power over you more or less. And then slowly, as we start getting to the second stage of developing a relationship, you are trying to claim back that power. I sort of become more collaborative over time and I share more about myself. And then we get to a space where, we dialogue about the world, which is two people coming to therapy to just discuss issues. And that's the last stage. It's a very good way to know when therapy ends. And it's so organic that if you do this, and for us, we practice this with people, that eventually our patients know when therapy is done because they no longer need us. And it's very organic. It's like, I'm coming to chit chat with you. Mm-hmm.
So it's a growth process of sorts in the patient.
Yes.
So they're growing to the point where they
no longer need us.
No longer need you, but they're also at a point where they can start to take the steps to take their power back in whatever way that manifests in that relationship.
Yes. And at the end, we sort of come to the understanding that, I'm an expert in asking questions and I'm an expert in mental health issues, but you are an expert in your life. But it's not, people say that, all therapists say that, and it sounds lovely, but people don't feel it. It's not an experiential endeavor for the patients. It's usually just a discussion as opposed to feeling it. So at the end of our process, you really trust yourself and you really believe that. And that gets us back to your second part of the question about love. Mm-hmm. I think the way we do that is through a very authentic relationship. Therapists shy away from saying that they love their patients, because we've been taught not to say it. And one of my patients challenged me a while back. She's like, I always say that I love you, but you're not gonna say it. What's up with that? So I was like, okay. So I went back home and, started reading countless articles about love in psychotherapy. Most of them were about erotic love. Most of them were what not to do. Very few of them dealt with genuine love and should we say to our patients that we love them. And I've come to the conclusion that we should. I mean, for this woman, after I did tell her, one of the things she said was, it was the first time in her life that someone actually said that to her, and she knew exactly what it meant, and she knew exactly that there was no strings attached.
That's big. That could be very big.
Yeah.
That's important, Mm-hmm.
The taboo in therapy being that someone could mean romantic love versus more of a nurturing love. But also I could see, could the taboo be that you're, I don't know, creating a relationship that's inappropriate with strings?
Yes. And I think the taboo is that we don't do such a good job as a society to talk about love independent of romance.
True.
Mm-hmm.
Everywhere you go, love is either transactional, I give you something, you give me something, or it's tied to sexuality and romance rather than genuine love for another person. And if we practice more of that, then we wouldn't be so, I say, almost defended. I think there is a defense against like, oh, I love you, but what does that mean? And are you going to misinterpret that? Rather than I love you because you're a human being that I've spent, let's say 2-3 years with, that we've shared very intimate things, that it would be crazy not to love you, I think. But again,
Wow.
how do you love without transaction, right? How do you genuinely, and how do you love someone without having an investment in the outcome?
Yeah. Oh, that's the big tough question everywhere, isn't it?
Okay, before you said that last part about expectant of an outcome, I was going to say the way that you love someone or love a society or show that is through activism, is by trying to make your society a better place, right? But then you said, not having an expected outcome. I'm like, well, I just blew that right out of the water.
Yeah, I think therapy love, when we think about, love in therapy, we have to think about being seen by another human.
Yes, that's it.
We see
Yes.
our patients and they see us. And this is why I think it's always a dynamic. Sometimes I've seen people 3 times a week for, let's say, 4 or 5 years. That's a very intimate relationship. I feel like that person knows parts of me that were relevant to therapy, and I know parts of them, and I've seen them in a way that no one else gets to see you. And that's what love is. So it's not like my investment is not, well, you should do this and you should do that. But my investment is, I am going to share this moment with you, and I am going to see you and you will see me. Now, we don't really practice that in our lives. And, one of the things when we talk about love in our course on love and psychotherapy, everyone who's in a relationship or married gets very, very sad, because I'm like, to really love another person is to really admit that they will never be yours.
I've always thought that.
If you're able to know that it's always about the journey and not the destination, it's not about, we're going to end up together forever, we're going to have 5 kids and 3 houses, but rather it's this moment that we share. And if that's good enough, and if that's a connection, then you do have a good relationships. But we don't talk about relationships that way. And this is why people struggle, right? Patients are like, well, love you, but this relationship ends. Yeah, all relationships end. We die. That's not the goal. The goal of relationship is not to not end. The goal of a relationship is the quality of it and how do we feel while we're in it. It's always about the moment.
That is probably the thing I needed to hear more than anything. How does it feel as a therapist when you have a patient that you're seeing 3 times a week for 5 years and then they don't need you anymore? How does that feel for you guys?
It's both sad and I think rewarding. This is why I think we do what we do, honestly, because we're invested in seeing how much people have changed. And it's sort of, I get to say I have all these intimate relationships with people. And I think it made me a better person in having my own relationships where I'm actually learning that it's not about we're going to be together forever necessarily, hopefully, but who knows? But it's about the journey we took. So it is tender and it is sad. Therapy also, I believe therapy needs to end, because if therapy didn't end, then it didn't cure you. And I do believe that therapy can cure you. So
You do.
Yeah.
I've heard a lot of people say that you don't get healed, you don't get cured, you just get better.
Yeah. I mean, maybe another way to say that, to be clear, is that you will always have your issues. It's not, we can't erase what happened to us, but we could turn it into a memory and we could understand what are our triggers. So for example, if your trigger is abandonment, when something hard happens in your life, you'll always go there. Oh, that's it. They're leaving me. I don't even care. So if you've done enough therapy, your job is to be like, this sounds like the same old narrative. Maybe take a pause and think about what's actually happening. And then maybe you want to react differently. And I do think that that's what cure looks like. It's not like I'm healed, it never happened to me. Think of something that has been broken and then you stitch it back together. You will always have the cracks, but that doesn't mean that it cannot hold things.
That's beautiful. I want to quote something on your website real quick. You said healing, mental health, and wellness cannot be achieved independent of political realities. Personal and political transformation are always intertwined. So that goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, that you really can't do the therapy without understanding the political circumstances of one's birth.
Well, it's yes, and the political circumstances of where we are, right? I mean, a very simple way, if we look at abortion, we are probably sort of, as women, right? We could talk about, oh yeah, having a right to an abortion is really important to one's mental health, because no one would want to have a child that they don't really want. But my question is, as a man or someone who identifies as a man, I will also pause and ask you to question yourself. What's your relationship to abortion, right? There are all these people are like, yes, I'm really pro-life. And, so my question would be, and how do you think you would be impacted if you have to have a child that you actually don't want? And how do you think that child is going to make it into the world knowing that you didn't want them? Because we often think of issues related or politics, right, when we think of how it impacts us, which is obviously important to know, but we don't think about how it impacts other people, and in turn, how it impacts society and how it impacts the world we live in.
And actually, like, generations.
Right. And we talk about intergenerational trauma, right? And it's so fascinating to me how people are like, well, racism, why are we still talking about it? Because if we know anything as therapists, is that there is such thing as intergenerational trauma. And, I've heard this quote, which was so lovely, which is that intergenerational trauma is that pain travels through families until someone is willing to feel it. But see, we think of that when we think of like, rape, but we don't also think of racism. We don't think of colonialism, but those are very real things that impacted your family for some people for years and generations. And to pretend that, well, we're over it now, I don't even know what that means, when we never dealt with it. Another good example of that is COVID-19. Everyone wants to move beyond it. Like, that's it. We don't want to talk about it. I actually have, I have an acquaintance that if I even bring up COVID, like, we're not going to talk about that here. But it has impacted all of us, not the same way. For some people, it was really traumatic. For other people, it was a stressor. But we haven't created a public space to mourn. We haven't talked about the losses. We don't know how to discuss what we missed out on. We don't know how to talk about the fact that there will never be another normal, whatever normal was. All of a sudden, normal became the cool thing to be. I don't know why. The normal wasn't that great to begin with. And COVID is also a good example of how issues around health are always intertwined to politics. No one wants to talk about COVID because politically it's suicide for anyone.
Right.
So therefore, we're like in this limbo where we can't mourn, we can't really publicly discuss. Think about 9/11. We still talk about 9/11, and that's okay. Yeah. Everyone talks about that. And what, 2,000, 3,000 people died. How many people died of COVID that we don't get to ever mourn?
Wow.
Because it's political. It's so political. The Democrats don't want to take it. The Republicans don't want to take it. No one wants to touch it. And I think it's also this idea that somehow normal was good enough. And this is what's so surprising. You had people who wanted to change the educational system. And all of a sudden, they just want their kids to go back to school the way it was. It's like, but you were saying it wasn't working. Maybe this is an opportunity to rethink that. But as a therapist, especially one that works with trauma, we also know that that's a reaction to trauma. What our first sort of go-to once we have experienced a traumatic event is we want to go back to normal. I'm okay. Nothing happened. It's going to be all right. As opposed to pause. Something actually happened. And in the absence of a public dialogue and a public space to mourn, I actually wonder where we're going to be in a couple of years with all these losses that we don't get to talk about.
How can critical therapy help us with this? How can we heal? How can we, and not just everything with COVID, but all of the other traumas that we all experience for any number of reasons, whether it's being a woman, being Black, being a refugee, being LGBTQ, being,
Yeah.
I mean, pick, right? Like how do we heal our society then?
I think, obviously, because I'm a therapist, is always through therapy. And this is
Mm.
why critical therapy needed to happen for me, because the old ways of therapy, I think, was good, but I don't think it was adequate enough to change us and to change society. And this is one of the reasons why we're trying to train more people. We're also going to do more workshops for people who are not in New York City, because I do believe there is a need for it. I do believe that, I mean, honestly, I think most people end up being therapists because they want to help people. No one says, I want to be a therapist to make money, or I want to be a therapist to change the world. They're like, I just want to help people in a good way. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people who are therapists who are not helping people. And that's not because they're bad, but I don't think our schools and our educational systems and our training really give us the tools to eloquently talk about these issues in a way that's therapeutic, rather than it's activating, or rather than I'm going to not even talk about this because I don't know how to deal with race.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to not mention it and hope no one mentions it,
On one of your posts, forgive me because I won't get this word for word, but you said something like, if we kind of collapse after a trauma, or if we break down, the bigger our breakdowns, the safer we are, or the safer we feel. When I read that, I thought, I never break down. Does that mean I don't feel safe?
Well,
So
yeah,
it's like,
or that you don't feel that anyone's there for you to pick you up. The way I learned that, honestly, was I was working in the domestic violence agency, and we ran crisis shelters. And you had all these women that would come to us, and they were strong and doing well, and they would come into our shelters and fall apart. They had breakdowns. They would start using drugs or alcohol, and everyone's like, what's happening? Why are they doing this? And it's because it was the first time in their lives that they were actually allowed to break down. It was the first time in their lives that they felt safe enough that someone was going to be there for them.
what was the actual statement?
I'm trying to remember what I said.
I know I couldn't get it either.
I don't know, but it was probably something that when we break down, when we feel the safest, or after an event.
It was something like that.
Yeah.
It was really profound. I read it and I couldn't stop thinking about it all day.
Thank you. And you also, by saying that, it sort of makes me wonder how little we do, or we give space in our society for people to feel safe, and how unsafe we actually feel, because most of us don't break down. We just keep going. And there's this almost like ethic of like, I'm going to be strong and I'm going to make it. And if I do, that talks about how resilient I am, rather than, okay, but you've gone through some shit and you need to sit with it.
Okay, I found it. After a traumatic event, the safer we feel, the more we fall apart.
Yeah, that was it. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. That really stuck with me. We haven't really talked about your book. We should talk about your book.
The book started during the pandemic, and it started out right before the pandemic. I was going to all these conferences and presenting on critical therapy, and people were like, you should write something. I was like, yeah, I don't have time. And then I said, I'm going to do a zine. So I paired up with a illustrator, like, we're going to do this zine together. And then we're like in it, and we have 50 pages, and we're like, that is not a zine anymore. Now this is a small book. So the book came about. It's a very short introduction to critical therapy. We also used it as it was Critical Therapy's Institute 10-year anniversary this year. So we launched the book, and it's a real short, and I hope very accessible book for both clinicians, but also patients. I would like for all of us who end up going to therapy to ask our therapists to practice differently, to ask our therapists to really show up in a very authentic way, and in a way that enables us to transform and to get to that human liberation, rather than accommodate and feel like, oh, I just feel so supported, which is okay. We should feel supported in therapy, but I don't know if that's the goal ultimately. I think for me, the ultimate goal is about transformations, and it's about liberation.
So should therapists ask questions that are related to our intersectionality in a way to get us to personally understand how all of that affects whatever we're in therapy for?
Yes. Yes. And it affects how we are in therapy. It also affects the way therapy gets to be done. Right. There is in this myth of nothing is political. It means that, for example, if you come to me as a white woman, our differences will always be present. We could pretend they're not there, and I don't think that's helpful, or we could actually discuss them. And I think that that's helpful. We could talk about the privilege that I have in certain areas and how that impacts how I show up in the room with you. And I think you could imagine how powerful it is for people to actually hear that and for people to be able to acknowledge their place in society in a very real way. And also, I want to say the same as with power, right? Unless we acknowledge privilege, right, we're not going to change anything. But privilege doesn't have to be bad. We sort of create this idea like no one wants to be privileged anymore. Well, we are. So I think of it as a responsibility. It's like, if I have access to certain power, if I have access to privilege, what am I going to do with it? Because I can't make it go away. Like our society is, I am always going to be that white lady walking into a room, and I could use that for good, or I could pretend that I don't have it. And I actually think that's very detrimental to everyone.
I agree. And I've actually had friends tell me that, say, what am I supposed to feel guilty because I have privilege? It's like, no, that's not the point.
Right. No, you're supposed to feel responsible. And the question is, now that you have that responsibility, what are you going to do with it?
The book is very accessible. It made a lot of sense. It makes a lot more sense talking to you. I know not everyone will get that opportunity. Having you explain some of the finer points really helps.
Now, you've talked about the institute and the training that y'all are doing. Are CTI trained therapists only in New York right now, or are they?
No, we're all in New York, and that's because of the licensing laws, because the training takes 4 years and we supervise you. So we might, one of my coworkers is toying around with the idea that she might be going to West Coast, and I don't want her to go, but I'm like, well, maybe if she goes, then we could do a West Coast Institute. So, baby steps, but I do want to create more workshops for people, especially therapists in Middle America, because I've heard stories about how they're not equipped to discuss these very real issues. And like I said, I think that if they had proper training, they would do it.
That's awesome.
What is your ultimate, like, if you could envision the world changing through therapy, what's your vision of what it looks like?
To expand democracy, right? And I know democracy is getting a bad, rap these days, but to really have more authentic relationships. And I think if we expand democracy and if we try to be more authentic, and eventually all those other things that we try to end, like racism, classism, sexism, I don't know if they'll disappear, but they'll be less and less and less. But it's a lot of work, and no one wants to start with them, right? We all want to start with this other, rather than let me start with myself. And if I can make a small change, then that's good enough. Again, we go back to, I used to believe of revolutions, and now I'm more like, well, let's just create some cracks. That's good enough. And my belief is, and I've heard it from my patients, so I'm not delusional, I hope not, is that if you are in therapy and if you practice this therapy, it gives you the space to create different relationships and create different spaces for people out there. So if you do it with me, you'll interact with others in a different way that hopefully will trickle down,
Wow. Well, I truly hope that you guys are able to grow this in a way that more therapists are trained in this, so that more people have access to this, because this is huge. There's so many people who don't go to therapy because they can't afford it. There's so many people who don't go to therapy because they're like, I'm not going to find a therapist who understands me, or who, and I'll just go ahead and say it. There are a lot of people of color who don't want to go to a therapist who does not look like them.
Right.
And I get that. It's hard to find. It's hard to find not just somebody who looks like you, but also somebody who then you feel comfortable with and who can guide you the way that you need to be guided. So I truly hope that the work that you're doing continues and that it grows, because I started out by saying it, Jennifer and I, we are huge proponents of therapy and think everybody can benefit from it in one way or 1,000. And so I hope more people get to benefit from the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you. And I hear you. And we talk about that a lot of people want to go to therapists that look like them. So, and I think that is important. And that's why we try to admit students from all walks of life in our clinical program. Right. And we've talked about this too. I also think that we need to, as therapists, be more honest and say the reason why people want more and more people that look like them, it's also because most therapists out there are racist or sexist.
Yes.
And
yes.
Instead of saying, well, let's just like these people who are others see all these others, it's like, no, we need to do a better job to be well versed. So both things need to happen at the same time.
Absolutely. Yes. And I'm so glad that you said that and that you put it that way, because that is very important as well. I, as a Black woman, have not ever had a Black therapist. I've only ever gone to white therapists. And thankfully, the therapist I have now, who I've been seeing a very long time, who maybe I've been seeing her for too long, I don't know, but she's a white woman and I feel incredibly comfortable with her. And we have had discussions that touch on politics and race and intersectionality. So they are out there.
And that's great. And especially because you've never gone to a therapist that was a woman of color, you could also appreciate why that would be important. And you could also appreciate why I think all the institutes out there are not doing a good job of attracting clinicians who are clinicians of color, because there are institutions that are so intertwined with racism. And just because you do a diversity or training or talk about, sort of multiculturalism doesn't mean you could erase the many years that the profession has, been racist, right? And if we're more honest, I think we would attract those people who would be like, yeah, I totally want to do this,
Was there anything that you wanted to tell our audience that you didn't get the chance to talk about?
No, I don't think so. This was a lovely conversation. Thanks for asking me all these questions. And I love to talk, as you can tell. So
we do too.
Yeah, we do very much. So thank you for being on and talking more about this and providing the insight into critical therapy and how it's so necessary.
So necessary. Great work. Really great work.
Thanks. And
thank
thanks
you for
your
putting
podcast. It's also, you do important work as well. I feel like podcasts are really the next thing now that people are like listening to, and I think it could change people's lives.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
All right. Bye, Silvia.
I'm going to try and read something real quick from her book as our recap. In this part, she talks about working with a client, and she says, we looked at how ideology informed her view of the world and her role in that world. For example, this ideology told her that her poverty was her family's fault due to poor planning, and therefore they deserved to be impoverished. It also told her that the Catholic Church was a protective institution that would never hurt her, and therefore, when it sanctioned her abuse, it was right and it was she who was wrong. This is why critical therapy is so important, because otherwise it leads to like self-hatred, self-blame without understanding it's the systems, as she said, the sexism,
it's internalizing all of it. It's internalizing capitalism. It's internalizing the racism, internalizing the colonization. It's making one believe that it's their fault
or their family's fault, or your family didn't prepare well enough,
or it just, those people are lazy, or those people, and they're just never going to get, but it's all working to internalize the harm and the trauma of the way that imbalanced power is inflicted on the other. Critical therapy is so needed. I know I already said it, but I'm going to say it again. I am so grateful for the work that Silvia and her colleagues are doing, writing the book, going on podcasts, training other therapists, and hopefully getting more of it out there.
100%. Such a great conversation and great book. And
I love this conversation. I really want people to take the time to listen to this and to read Silvia's book and go to her website, and links to all of that will be in the show notes, people, but absolutely do yourself a favor and check Silvia out and all the work that she's doing.
bye, Raquel.
Bye, Jennifer. Thanks everyone for listening today. We will be back with more Madness Cafe next week. You can find us on Instagram at Madness Cafe Podcast or email us at madnesscafepodcast@gmail.com. Bye.